Welcome to week 2 of the Music of the Rolling Stones 1962 to 1974. This week we're really going to focus on the year 1965 in the history of the Rolling Stones. And this is a year I call the Year of Satisfaction, most obviously because the group's first big #1 hit in the United States, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, was a hit in the mid-year 1965, and that was the song that really sort of put them over the top as a top act to really compete with the Beatles in the U.S. Now, remember, last week we were talking about the group's history through 1962, 63, and 64, and saying that in 64 they had a lot of success in the UK. #1 records, EPs, things like that are, very successful ones. But in the United States, it was a little bit of a tougher go for the Rolling Stones, tougher than it was for a lot of the other British invasion groups. Of course, the Beatles were top of that heap, but there were a lot of other groups, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Dave Clark Five, even the Animals, groups like that were really big in 1964 while the Rolling Stones were struggling. But things at the end of 64 really start to pick up for the group, and that's kind of where we're going to pick up our story here, talking about just the end of 1964 and then focusing in on 1965. In this video, we'll kind of review what was happening with the Stones historically in the first half of 1965. So let's rewind to the fall of 1964. In September, they released the 12 by 5 album in the United States. And they also released the Jagger-Richards single, Heart of Stone, that's backed with another Jagger-Richards tune, What a Shame. That's released in December of 1964. And it's number 19 on the US charts as 1965 begins. So things are looking better and better for the group as the year begins. In January, they tour Australia, and that includes New Zealand and other locales. So getting further afield, getting out into the world with some of their touring. The second UK album is released in January. Simply called Rolling Stones 2, and Rolling Stones Now, which is now the third US album, because remember 12 by 5 was not released as a UK album. So we're coming back together again. These albums are starting to be parallel sessions. So we'll talk mostly about Rolling Stones Now and the Rolling Stones 2 album, the UK and the US version. Anyway, that was released, the American version, Rolling Stones Now, was released in the US in February of 1965. In the next month, the group released the song The Last Time, backed with Play with Fire. Again, both songs Jagger-Richards compositions. That song had been released the last time as a single in the UK in February and gone to #1, but that was by this time nothing new for the Rolling Stones, who, as I say, were having great success in the UK. But now, The Last Time makes it as high as #9 on the American charts, and so they're really closing in. Now they're into the top 10, right? So that's pretty good. Of course, it's going to be Satisfaction. It's going to take them all the way to the top of those charts in a couple of months. Well, in April and May, they have their third U.S. tour. When I say U.S. tour, my friends in Canada, please excuse me for that. A lot of times the U.S. tour is really a North American tour because there are usually a couple of Canadian gigs, a Montreal gig or a Toronto gig on that schedule. Primarily a U.S. tour, but we should probably say North America for that. So that's April and May of 1965. I Can't Get No Satisfaction is released in the United States in May and goes to #1 in the charts. So that's a really important kind of event for them, a point of arrival. And then in the UK only, an EP, a live EP called Got Live If You Want It, is released in the UK and is #1 on the charts at the same time as the song Satisfaction is #1 in the charts in the US. That actually delays the release of Satisfaction in the UK until August. You don't want to step on yourself by having two top records at the top of the charts in the UK. So in fact, in August when Satisfaction is released, it goes to #1. It occurred to me that maybe I should explain to folks who are either Americans who are younger, under the age of 40, say, or people who don't understand or don't have a lot of experience or understanding of American television during the 1960s, what the Ed Sullivan Show means. When we talk about the career of the Beatles, one of the big sort of high points of their career is their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. That show, the Ed Sullivan Show, was a New York-based variety show run by a guy who was part of the New York art scene, a writer who in the 50s already started having a variety show where there was really a family show, something for everybody, something for the kids, something for grandma, all kinds of things, jugglers, there were puppets. I mean, a real variety show in the sense that we don't really have so much anymore on television. Anyway, to get on that show in America was really to get into one of the great primetime slots, 8 o'clock on Sunday night, when there were only 3 networks and a couple of independents around that really had a way of focusing the audience. So when we talk about the Rolling Stones appearing on Ed Sullivan, what I mean to say is whenever they appear on Ed Sullivan, the more times they appear, the more they're at the really at the center of the radar of the popular music business. So that's what I mean when I say they appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And if you go to YouTube, you'll be able to find the videos of them appearing. Those performances are live when they're not video performances that are shipped in like later. We'll talk about. But the ones here in these early years, 64, 65, 66, are all live performances. You get a chance to hear them performing absolutely live the way it sounded. Well, I'd like to take a little bit of time, because I promised to do so, to talk about Mick and Keith as songwriters and some of the early singles. And you remember last week, I said that we talk about Tell Me as being the first, A-side that the Stones released and the first song that Mick and Keith really wanted to bring to the group. Also, they were writing a lot of brill-building-y kind of stuff that they were having other artists record and release. These were most often, I think almost entirely, artists that Andrew Loog Oldham was managing. So just as the Beatles were writing tunes for Brian Epstein's other groups, Mick and Keith were doing that too. So let me just give you a list of some of the Jagger Richards songs that appeared not by the Rolling Stones. In January of 1964, so that's actually pretty early. That's only a couple of months after they released their version of the Beatles, I Want to Be Your Man. I think that's the event that really got these guys thinking we could write our own songs. That is in late 1963. Anyway, in January of 64, a song by Gene Pitney called That Girl Belongs to Yesterday went to number 7 in the UK charts. A Jagger and Richards original song at number 7 in January of 1964. Goes a little bit against the way we usually think of the Rolling Stones narrative, don't you think? A guy by the name of George Bean released a song in January 64 called Will You Be My Lover Tonight? Not much information on the chart action on that one. Bobby Jameson did a song, a B-side of one of his records was called Each and Every Day. That was in February of 1964. Adrian Posta in March of 64 did a tune called Shang a Dulang. I really recommend you go onto YouTube or wherever you find videos and see if you can hear versions of these tunes. YouTube's about the only place I've been able to find them because the recordings were so unpopular they haven't even been reissued digitally, I think. Of course, then in June of 64, the Stones' own Tell Me is released as a single in the United States, though it had appeared in April of 64 on an LP, and then Good Times, Bad Times is the B-side that was also released in June of 64. Then Marianne Faithfull records and releases the Stones Jagger Richards As Tears Go By, which in June of 64, again summer of 64, is a number 9 hit in the UK, number 22 in the US. Then a group called the Mighty Avengers, sounds more like Marvel comic characters, but the Mighty Avengers do a song called So Much in Love in August of 64. Then we have the Rolling Stones with the B-side to Time Is On My Side, Congratulations, which is released in September of 64. And then Grown Up Wrong is on the LP 12 by 5, released in September of 64. So you can see there's lots of Jagger, and this isn't even all of them. I mean, I culled out a number to be able to list for you here. So the real story is that Jagger and Richards as songwriters are having pretty moderate success in 1964, especially on the UK charts, before they start to have success writing songs or with singles for their own group, the Rolling Stones. So I think it adds a little bit more texture to the understanding of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards as songwriters. And later this week, I'll come back to talking about all the different styles that we see in the cover versions and some of the originals in the Rolling Stones, because I really want to paint a picture of these guys as being very eclectic stylistically. in spite of the fact that their image is kind of blues revivalists and tough guys and ne'er-do-wells and this kind of thing. Actually, as songwriters, it's pretty sophisticated stuff. So there we talk a little bit about the history of the first half of 1965 with the group and the role of Mick and Keith as songwriters. Let's turn in the next video to a discussion of some of the Stones singles in more detail.